There are departments upon departments of people whose job is to shape narratives and to streamline things and to make it look like it was more sure of a thing. It was more planned than it was these people are visionaries, yada, yada, yada. And I worked in the communications department.
You're thinking of building a company or already run a company that is not registered, but you want to get registered. I've looked at a lot of solutions, and one of the best ones in the market right now is Doula. I reached out to Arjun, who is actually the founder of Doula.com, and I asked him if he'd like to work together on the podcast. He was like, of course. Doula is sort of a platform that helps founders and businesses form and manage US companies, regardless of where they live. If someone is living in India, for example, and wants to start a company and get registered in the US, he or she can do it by using Doula.com. Doula helps in forming the company. It can be an LLC, C Corp, or you name it. Doula offers a US address and a bank account to users, which can allow you to conduct business transactions that you can receive and send payments no matter where you live in the world from the United States. And other than that, they also provide tax consultation to the users, which is an incredible feature. And Doula simplifies the process of establishing and managing a US company, and especially for founders that are not in the US. And regardless of where they live, you can get your company registered with Doula.com. To check out Doula, go to doula.com/exerton. That is DOOLA.com/EXERTON.
So, hey Patrick, how are you? You're doing well?
I'm doing well, thank you. How about yourself?
Try to well. But I've been looking for this such a long time. I hope we sort of get to know how the world works by the end of this episode. But before we get into the other stuff, let's start with who's Patrick? Who are you?
Sure. I'm not sure I even have an answer to this question anymore, come to think of it. I always used to start my self-introduction with, so I went to Japan right after university and ... And then a year ago, after 20 years of living in Japan, I moved back to the United States with my family for family reasons. And so my canned self-introduction is stale and I don't have a new one yet. I worked in substantially all of my career in the software industry, in a bit in Japanese megacorps, a bit in startups in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and a bit in running my own companies, and am currently ambiguously sort of still maybe in the software industry, although I'm on semi-sabbatical at the moment. I took my leave of Stripe from my previous employer about a year and a half ago, and do not have a full-time gig at the moment, but continue writing for the internet, which is something I'm reasonably well known for in tech circles. And I also, have my own podcast to keep me busy and out of trouble.
What do you think makes Japan different? There's going to be a pretty hard pivot, but this is something that I think about a lot. And Japan is, in the slang ways, it's very cool. But what do you think makes them different from the rest of the world?
So theoretically speaking, I have a degree in answering this question from my undergrad time. And the one thing that I would hope people would take away from a good undergrad degree or a good book on the subject is that most of the common answers are not that great. The common answer is like Japanese culture is totally different than, American or Indian or similar culture, which is punk, basically. There's a very reasonable case for saying rather than locating it in among quote unquote Eastern cultures, Japanese culture is located like somewhere in the middle of the English Channel. There are parts that rhyme more with France, and there are parts that rhyme more with the UK. A lot of American observers of Japan identify things about Japan that they think are weird, which they're actually identifying as weirdnesses of the United States that Japan shares with virtually every other culture. And so I don't think culture is the kind of one-stop shop for the explanation that is often advanced. At the same time, to the extent you can make generalities about any diverse group of people, there is such a thing as Japanese culture that does there are material consequences to that culture. And some of those material consequences bubble up in kind of things that people are interested in. if I were to give people two really good books to read on the subject, one is Making Common Sense of Japan, which is increasingly out of date, but essentially thoroughly buries the culture is the only explanation thesis. And the other one is Sugimoto's Japanese Society. Japan is also often depicted as this monolithic entity, which is extremely untrue. And that's a book-length academic refutation of like the image of the Japanese salaryman. And I was a Japanese salaryman in some ways, not in one way, obviously, but like the image of the Japanese salaryman is coextensive with the Japanese experience in the minds of many foreign observers. That is roundly not the case. And so this book talks about the exceptions to the rule and how the sum of all the exceptions creates the rule. So would recommend people take a look on that.
I was doing the same thing. Culture is so relative to where you are.
Culture is often used as kind of an error term, where in things close to our experience, why did you choose to join the software industry? Why did you choose to start a podcast? Why did you choose to marry your wife? People have robust answers to those questions, and they never say, well, I joined the software industry because that's just American culture. But when you have less good models of the processes in place, you have more error term, and then we just choose to call that error term culture. So, people often ask, like, why is the hierarchical environment so bad in Japanese businesses? And, it goes back to culture. See, there's samurai, blah, blah, blah. No one ever answers that question in the United States with, well, it harkens back to the Anglo-Saxon tradition of lords versus knights, because, like, obviously that's crazy. And if you had a better understanding of the dynamics at play, you would say, okay, well, a more appropriate analogy might be that of tenured civil servants in the United States. They display a lot of the pathologies that you see in large, traditionally managed Japanese companies, and they have much of the same hierarchical relations between subordinates and their bosses and with the system in general. And so, and again, culture is a real thing in the world. There are, in fact, things that the kind of default operating system installed in young Japanese people by their society is different than the default operating system in, say, the United States. But I think it is just over advanced as a cause for many things.
How much role do you think does culture play in the basic foundations that we live upon as a society?
More than zero, probably a lot in aggregate. It's observationally the case that not all cultures, generate the same decisions given the same facts on the ground, that they don't all achieve, similar sets of outcomes. There's a huge amount of confounding variables from like the built reality of the environment, et cetera, into who gets what outcomes. And so, it's one of those tough things to tease out. But there's many other tough things to tease out, which is we will probably continue keeping people employed in universities debating this question fruitlessly for another few thousand years. Like, humans exist on a biological substrate. That biological substrate is like kind of very similar for all of us relative to the difference between us and dogs or us and a potted plant. But it is very different between individuals, and how much does the biological substrate like leak into the lived experience of being a person, either in general or in your own life? It's kind of a lot. Like, definitionally, we don't live the same life as a potted plant. But is that like really an interesting observation or question to be asking relative to all the other things that are going on in your life that you aren't a potted plant? I think there are limits to that level of inquiry.
But if you were to just like bang on the same wall, how would you define culture?
It is a very amorphous term, and kind of for a reason. Just like, how would you define someone's personality? Well, it's the somewhat cynical view that I tend to adopt on it is that much like personality, it's sort of the things that happen when someone doesn't realize they're making an intentional choice at all, sort of like default outcomes of a system, the default way of evaluating the world, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe, mutually reinforcing set of defaults across all of society, which gets transmitted over time. The transmission of culture over time and the transmission of culture as an intentional act are extremely important lenses to think of when having any discussion of culture. And then, if it's an arbitrarily deep well, like the fact that any discussion of culture is necessarily incomplete because there are many cultures in any subgroup of people, probably down to, almost certainly down to, the individual. On the one hand, I'm fairly familiar with American culture, having grown up here and lived here until graduating university. On the other hand, I'm shockingly unfamiliar with many aspects of the many cultures that make up America. On the gripping hand, I can both simultaneously be a member of the culture that is, middle upper class Americans in the tech industry, whatever you want to call that, and the culture that is Japanese salarymen, including being aware that there are many people in one of my cultures who say, "You are obviously not a Japanese salaryman," and in the other culture who would say, "Dudes, you don't get a vote on this," feel this tension in my own head at any given time. But that's a little bit of inside baseball. So,
yeah, culture is weird. I agree with your point. Yeah, it's a tough thing to sort of suss out what culture really means in society. But you talk about culture changing over time there. It does change over time. If we say that culture is a foundation that a society is built upon and it changes over time, what do you think are some things that the foundations that will never change or that was set up a long time ago but are never going to be replaced or changed or taken over related to institutions that you like to talk about?
So, we live under conditions of scarcity, never changes in the large. Our capability of imagining new things to want will probably forever outpace our ability to deliver on those wants immediately. Relative to previous human societies, we live in an age of incredible, unbelievable abundance. We live in an age of incredible power to impact the cosmos in a way that our ancestors could literally not even dream of or conceptualize. And yet, as people who are merely living in 2024, we see all these problems in the world, all the ways in which our own lives we don't have what we want, et cetera, et cetera. And our mental model of future humans should probably sound a little bit more like us in that respect. We've got flying cars. We've had flying cars for 100 years, but your flying cars can't get you to Mars. You have to go on a ship, and only rich people in rich companies can, afford to get to Mars. It costs a full 2 weeks of labor. Do you have any idea how exclusionary that is? So riffing a little bit here, but
Great.
The broader point about institutions and technological change are two sides of the same coin. And what's the old saw? We create our machines, and then our machines create ourselves. All software artifacts are written in the context of a particular team, a particular organization, a particular broader culture that surrounds that organization. Increasingly, a particular broader culture that surrounds the software industry and is distinct from the culture that is American professionals, as it is from the culture that is Indian cricket players, where we're having this conversation, and if you picked me off the street and someone who had spent the equivalent amount of time in the software industry, but strictly in India, we would probably sound a lot more like each other when talking to each other than I sound like the typical person picked off the street of Chicago or the typical person picked out of their neighborhood. So software, these artifacts, technical artifacts, are created by a culture, and they embed some of the assumptions of that culture. Then increasingly over time, the culture starts to re-imbibe some of the assumptions from its artifacts and double down on them. The culture that is music and how much remixing is appropriate, and what is a pastiche versus what is a parody versus what is a knowing reference to other fans versus what is just being, like a bit of an asshole with respect to that guy you just ripped off. These are like very tied to both, some abstract notion of culture of what is considered the true and right and ethical thing to do as a musician in your community, and maybe tied to like some concrete instantiations of culture, like the copyright law in the United States, for example. But it's also tied very directly to what are the capabilities of musicians and what are the business models of the places that employ musicians. We can produce lossless, like perfect. The audiophiles will say they're not perfect. They're perfect. Like a perfect replica of any individual's audio performance on a device that, maybe not the device that literally fits in your pocket, although that'll get you increasingly close. But if it's a studio setup and you get an MP3 file of that MP3 file can be reproduced costlessly for the rest of the time. And that fact has to impact how musicians think of like, what is the bundle of goods I provide society? It can't be stamping out, the same song in the same diction in, the same perfect performance every time, because a computer can do like the clone stamp thing a billion times, and I still got to eat. And so, with that technical change in the moving in music industry, we move away from the industry that is based around record sales and similar towards one where it's based more on, I would say, as someone who's outside of the industry and does not really producing it all that often, kind of sort of more around like parasocial relationships between artists and their fans, and an artist as a figurehead of a tribe, and your consumption of their music and merchandise and opportunities to see them in person being a tribal signifier. The Swifties tell us something that is both like simultaneously true of Taylor Swift and the people who like her a lot, true of the construction of culture among a couple of generations in primarily the United States, and true about the economics of the music industry.
That's a good point. If you take the whole music industry as an example, you just use that. How do you think, as that changes, and it's not a fundamental change where people are stopping listening to music as a whole. They're more like how they are listening to music, the methods are changing, and sort of the way that music is produced. So that's one of the artist side of things. But how does over time, when things change so drastically, how does the whole institution that is of the music industry, how does adaptation to that work?
One, it's complicated. Two, a thing that we often see as institutions adapt to technological change is that the capital I institution, the capital S system, doesn't really like change. It has gotten to its current position in society by kind of like systemizing the daily delivery of something, whether that is, recorded music, or whether that is the provision of day-to-day medical care, or whether that is, public benefits. The system is capable of like showing up on Monday and Tuesday to do substantially what it did last week. It excels less at being on the cutting edge of its changes to itself. A thing you will typically see is that change arrives at the institution in kind of like different at different rates in different places, and really useful, both like this is news you can use, and also a good way to understand how things happen in the world was, I think, Clayton Christensen, who's big in software and similar circles, came up with this notion that people in parts of society that are underserved by existing institutions will typically encounter the technical changes first, because they have a extremely unsatisfactory experience in the status quo with regards to whatever the good or service being provided is. And on day one, and also probably on day 100 and day 1,000, the new thing is going to be worse than the old way of doing things for most of the people who are best served by the old way of doing things, but it might be transformatively cheaper, transformatively more available, et cetera, than the thing for people who are tremendously underserved. And so this is the worse is better thesis. And, so when you look at the proliferation of electronic money, for example, electronic money was invented in places like, for example, the United States, but didn't achieve overwhelming success in the U.S. market for a while. And we're bracketing the entire discussion of what is electronic money here, and that's professionally relevant to me. So just take that as written. Electronic money didn't win in the United States first. It first won in places like Kenya as M-Pesa, the professional glosses. It's a stored value system which is connected to a mobile operator, which is a bunch of jargon words that we don't quite have time for. But the important thing to recognize is like people in the United States had money that worked pretty well. And people in the United States had a lot of money relative to like the typical person in Kenya. But the typical person in Kenya both controlled less resources, and the resources that were available to them through the financial system were just much worse than they are in most countries. And thus, the operation of mobile money systems kind of leapfrogged sort of like naive view of technical development. Well, first they're going to get a really robust banking system with good regulators, and then they're going to get credit cards, and then they're going to get like without making any strong claims about the Kenyan banking system, the proliferation of credit cards basically did not happen. They went straight to this new thing. And then part of the thesis is often like, and then that new thing is going to get adopted everywhere as everywhere understands the benefits of the new thing. But we can look around and we still use credit cards and bank accounts in the United States, and we don't use mobile money systems, not in the same way that M-Pesa operates. The financial system considered as a whole, like we have this change, which has been rapidly adopted somewhere, not necessarily percolated to other aspects of it, but the other aspects of it, because financial systems necessarily need to interoperate, need to be aware of this change in, one part of the world, and indeed in this growing portfolio of complex interconnected changes within the ecosystem. Change arrives differently at institutions and at different rates. Sometimes, there's like different pathways for things to change over time. Sometimes you see change arrive differently at different rates in different places, and then the institution kind of, through various political or semi-political processes, decides, yep, we're doing it now. And so, if you look at like the adoption curve of cloud services versus the traditional ways to deliver software and hardware at scale to businesses and polite society. In the early days, and I was working in Japanese megacorp selling to universities at one point, and we were like, hey, universities are they're never going to use this cloud thing. They want to have server rooms until the heat death of the universe and be fully in control of their data and not have privacy issues, yada yada. And that was thought by a lot of people with regards to cloud services. Fortuitously for Amazon, it was not thought by the people in charge of AWS. And they just kind of, dragged the rest of the world's kicking and screaming. They and like a large part of the technology industry. This is not necessarily one person in the scheming back room going, I'm going to kill the server room as an institution. But Amazon et al. Successfully convinced the entire world that owning a server room might no longer be your organization's highest mission in life. And at some point along that transition, it went from like, okay, the startups don't want to run their own servers, but we're serious to, via formal decision-making pathways. Like the United States of America has a number of like subnational capital I institutions that publish, IT requirements for data security within the United States of America, including like in the parts which, the military, the parts that are organized around killing people and breaking things, and in the parts that are, that is not the prime focus of the mission on most days. And in like many of those places, it's like, by default, you should expect to use cloud services. Here's how the United States uses cloud services to maximize for our national interest. And protect privacy and security, which you will do much better than by administering your own servers. I mean, only a loser would do that, right? Which that is not a direct quote from any of the technical documents, but one could be excused for coming away with that gloss from them.
Oh, wow. Alright, we went from payments to discussing on capital institutions. I'll just break it down. We'll start with the payments part. Payments is broken. Like, payments are financial stuff, and like how money is transferred. It's so bad. Like, it's like so bad. Even after so much innovation from like PayPal, the Stripe, and all these private companies that are doing it. I'm in India, so it's terrible here. I mean, the national one, the UPI part, it's great. But sort of the international payments to and from the country, it's terrible. It's like very bad. If you talk about payments specifically, why is it so messed up?
Let's start with a big, huge conceptual mismatch that a lot of people have. On the one hand, payments is very concrete and accessible to us because we use it every day of our daily lives, and we assume this must be something which is like obviously understood by everybody. How can something that is obviously understood by everybody be so bad? And yet, payments smuggles in a huge portion of all of humans' economic and intellectual activity under the covers. And so that mismatch between like the true complexity of the problem and what we perceive as the complexity of the problem causes a lot of the difficulty in payments. And so, as an example here, the financial industry is like plus or minus 20% of the economy in most countries. The government varies widely in different places, but if you were to say like plus or minus 40%, I think you get in the right range. And so a system which like naturally pulls in 60% of all human economic activity or intellectual effort will end up being quite complicated. And it kind of does that, because there are there are many goals that society has for its payment systems, and some of those goals like are in conflict with each other in the way that we have limited resources. Our government has a limited number of points to put the time and attention of smart people into achieving society's aims, and the wonderful brokenness of the world is what we end up with in like the current equilibrium. And so, without pointing at like specific things that happened, like there is many concrete things that happen in the world, let's say local to you, with regards to what is and is not usable with respect to payments in India. What is it trivial to like spend money on? What is it less trivial to spend money on? Are downstream of major political questions in the political system that is India. And obviously, I'm not the right person to talk that much about the political system that is India, having never lived there. But there are very material consequences to things that are like on the top of the agenda of the RBI in the course of like the next 6 months. And some of those consequences are going to eventually like bubble up onto your cell phone. And so the
RBI is the Reserve Bank of India for the people.
Right. For those of you who don't know, it's a central bank and de facto regulator of payments, where those might be two different things in some other political systems. But if you were to go to a professor of politics or civil society or similar at an arbitrarily great university in India and say, can you just like give me the discussion of why it is hard to get things accomplished in the political system? They would probably tell you, that is not a quick discussion. That is something you could devote your lives to. And so necessarily lurking under the surface of whatever the beautifully designed pixels are in your app of choice is a topic that like people devote their lives to. And so that's one of the reasons. And there's like many other things. Payments are not simply difficult because payments touch government by nature and government is difficult. And they're not simply difficult because it touches like, the broader than government political desire to accomplish different things with scarce resources. One fact that is underappreciated is because payments intermediate substantially all economic transactions in an economy. Not all.
Yeah.
That's okay. The payment industry would love to say that it intermediates substantially all economic transactions, but that's because we have a blinkered view of economic transactions, where we think it's an economic transaction if it causes revenue for a payments company. Very many economic transactions have an explicit payment with them. The number of firms engaged in economic transactions is very large. The number of people engaged in economic transactions also very large. And the complexities of all those relationships sort of spill into the payments artifacts. The payment of rent is an enormously important economic activity in virtually all places in the world. Okay. Coming from the American experience, payment to rent, pretty important. Probably pretty important in much of India, probably pretty important in many of the places people live.
Yeah.
But the landlord-tenant relationship and society's point of view with regards to how the landlord-tenant relationship must work is not simply described merely by the pixels that pop up on your phone when you are sending money to your landlord. The amount of work society has put into that relationship specifically, it's in the Bible. We have very strong intuitions with regards to how it should work. We have a huge amount of law and similar that regulate the day-to-day experience of it. And then there's also the brute reality that not all landlords and not all tenants are equivalently sophisticated, either with each other or under the broad category of landlord or tenant. And so any system which is designed to facilitate rent payments, among other payments, will both need to treat rent payments a bit differently than it does other payments, and also need to function for a huge range of people in a huge range of circumstances. And rent payments are a mere subset of the entire complexity of the economy bouncing off each other that gives rise to payments. Salary payments, very different than rent payments. We have very different moral intuitions with regards to salary payments. We have huge moral intuitions with regards to salary payments, though. And so when you ask people consider the question of reversibility in payments, is that a desirable feature or not? People will often have a very snap off the cuff feeling of that, which might or might not be based on their personal experiences with reversibility of transactions. And so if your snap off the cuff feeling is all transactions should be reversible if they were a mistake. Really? Can an employer unilaterally withdraw money from the account of someone who no longer works with them? And then people are like, oh, no. It's okay, so we have complicated intuitions about reversibility. And I could flip that around. No payment should be reversible. Really? If the result of human error results in a senior citizen paying 10 times the agreed upon rent to a rapacious landlord, and the landlord refuses to make them whole, should that payment be totally irrevocable? Oh, no. We have complicated intuitions here. And so payments are complicated because humanity is complicated, and humanity wants payments to do so much for it. When the internet first came up in the United States, the dominant way that Americans chose to pay for things over the internet was the credit card, for long, complicated U.S. cultural and historical reasons. Credit cards are relatively safer to give to a person that you might trust, lest the internet was a hive of scum and villainy at the time, so therefore do all your business on credit cards versus doing it on checking accounts. Credit cards have this interesting feature where you can give someone a credit card either before or after they tell you the details of the transaction that you're done with, and then they can go off for a while and do whatever, taking 10 milliseconds or 10,000 seconds. It doesn't really matter, and then the transaction can go through. And it turns out that when the rubber hits the road, that is relatively easy for people in computing environments with low levels of bandwidth, terrible computing primitives, et cetera, to code up. Where if you introduce a requirement in the flow anywhere for there needs to be a truly synchronous check with a bank or a financial intermediary, then the experience of making applications to take that payment method becomes much more difficult. And if you change the semantics of the payment method to say, I'm a business, I'm coming with like the terms here, but you're just giving me authorization to do whatever I want, to no, we don't trust you businesses in this economy. We want you to give them, like, communicate to the user the exact terms. And then we are going to verify those exact terms by like re-communicating those terms to the user in a way which you can't tamper with, which is, to my understanding, a like fairly fundamental part of authorizing RBI payments. The physical reality of programmers at their keyboards making that happen in like the late 1990s would have been very, very different than making credit card payments happen in the late 1990s. And so, this is an interplay of various complicated factors, like how much do we as a human society trust businesses that we're dealing with? How much do we assume like actors that are transacting with each other are necessarily transacting in a repeated game versus like a one-off game? And then what consequences does this have for the engineering artifacts that we ship as a society? And then how does this change over, a 1 decade or 2 decade time frame? How does this change when systems that are made in the United States and assume that everyone has a credit card because that's the natural way to transact on the internet, arrive in places like India or Japan, where like credit card penetration is rather low, but like the economy nonetheless exists. Thank you, Americans. It's just not, in fact, necessary to have a credit card. And then, a thing that Stripe has mentioned a couple of times as being a bit of a requiring major efforts both internally and externally was like the orientation away from charges as an objects in the API is like the fundamental building block of economic interaction is charges, to the fundamental building block is this thing we're calling payments in tense now. And it's more difficult to reason about than charges is, but it is like a better abstraction to reason about an RBI payment than the charge abstraction was. So like many people inside and outside the company spent years working on the transition from charges to payment intents as like the core API primitive. And you can reasonably like think that some people might have said, well, charges are like a really, that's how my customers think of the transactions they're making. That's how I think of the transactions I'm making. Why can't I keep using the charges thing for forever? And the answer to that is like really complicated. But the basic answer is like, we looked around the entire world because we're making infrastructure for a very large subset of the entire world. And it turns out like charges are not the right way to model the world in this domain. And then you kind of hope as an infrastructure company that you, make some set of primitives and that both yourselves and other product teams build on top of those primitives to give intermediate software systems that are good for the needs of like various populations of interest. And, the typical consumer of any sort of infrastructure doesn't interface with that infrastructure at the lowest possible levels. They're, they are consuming the outputs of it that are often brought to them by an intermediary. I don't have to know, as someone who drinks water in Chicago, what exactly happens at the Chicago treatment plant. I just know a bill arrives from the city every month, and the water out of my faucet almost certainly isn't going to kill me. And then, after that, somebody else's problem. And on the one hand, that conserves attention from me. I don't have to think about water that often. That doesn't conserve attention about water in the water treatment plant. They still have to care a whole lot about what the appropriate level of alum in water is.
I want to go back to your previous point. You talked about capital I institutions.
Was a time in the corporate history of Stripe where Stripe was one payment method among many that was used by perhaps some forward-thinking tech startups and not that all that many other people. And these days, Stripe processes more than, I think, $1 trillion a year is a publicly quoted number. And somewhere in the, I don't know what the breakpoint was, but somewhere between $0 and $1 trillion, it started to matter. And so the, flipping the question around a little bit, groups of people who accomplish something of impact on human society will eventually find themselves in a position of both having I don't love the word power for this, but I don't know how to describe it without using the word power. You will have the ability to impact the lives of others. And because you have that ability, you will have a responsibility to exercise that in a wise fashion, wise and just fashion, let's say. Partly we as a society outsource our opinions on wisdom and justice to the political process as reflected in democratic institutions, et cetera, which is a partial answer to it, but it doesn't absolve individual groups of people from the importance of these things. One reason it doesn't is that the capital I institutions that are civil society necessarily understand the object level reality of these things much less well than the people who built them do. A challenge for startups on the way from zero to massive societal impact is internalizing some of the hard questions about how to build things and what goals to optimize for, et cetera. But how do you create an institution from nothing? The very glib answer is you start by making something that people want, and then you successfully give it to enough people, and eventually you will have created something from nothing, and that thing will be very valuable to society. And at some point there come some heady questions as to how you make decisions about that thing that you have created. And you might find yourself in a position of having power or influence or impact, which you might not have set out to do. This happens frequently in the tech industry. We're aware that we are trying to create something that people want. We are at least semi-aware that we are trying to create something that grows for a very long time, and that will change how humans interact with particular things that humans do. We're far less aware that in the case of success, we're we starting on day one of opening up the editor and tapping up some code and pivoting and maybe getting into YC and yada yada, that we are building the next generation of human institutions. And so maybe an awareness of that is important. Don't let it distract from actually building things people want. Building things that people want is a necessary prerequisite to get to the point where you are building institutions. But worth more than zero thought about how you design your company culture, who you decide to invite into it, et cetera, et cetera. You're not constituting a government, but you're not constituting a government. You're not writing founding documents. You're not laying down the cultural foundations for an organization that you can't currently see, that will be making decisions on behalf of a large number of people 10, 20, 30 years from now. And so some awareness of that is helpful. I think on the flip side, capital I institutions, I wish I could tell more of them, hey, that making something people want thing, that's pretty important for you. You should probably do that, as an intentional practice, kind of frequently. You are not simply here because, in the case of the United States, we won a war against a version of the UK that is no longer a hereditary monarchy anymore.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I know it's complicated, but we throw a dartboard at the org chart that is the United States of America. The water department in the city of Chicago is not simply a historical artifact of some people who now call themselves Americans won a war against King George III and thus water department. Like the water department has to actually do a bunch of things every day. The water department, like relative to all governmental institutions in the United States, I'm pretty happy with the services it delivers. Like the water is available almost every day, and the water almost never kills people. And those are like both. I should be like more laudatory than I am. Like it is shockingly reliable relative to other services that are delivered. And so on the one hand, that's like a low bar. The government should like kill very few people accidentally. It is like a low bar for a democratic society, but it's an important bar to hit. And so, clap, clap, the water department very rarely kills people accidentally, and the water almost always works. But there are other institutions, and I will avoid making this a political and or partisan rant, but there are other institutions that like should look to the example of the water department and discover like, what is the thing that we actually exist to do today? And are we successfully doing that thing? And if that answer is simply like we're, producing reports to produce reports, or we like legitimate things as the yada yada because somebody won a war against King George III, and like maybe start shipping something to society that actually works, or clear the field for people who do.
How do you think, if you talk about how long have we known the Colson brothers?
I've been writing on the internet since about 2006, and I think they started reading my writing sometime between 2006 and 2010. 2010, Patrick has tweeted about this, so I'll share an email. He sent me an email about this pay demon concept he was working on with his brother John while they were both living down in Buenos Aires. And sadly, I did not get that email. Spam filtered it. But I got a couple of emails over the years, and did a couple of Skype calls, etc., and was always kind of confused. Like, you actually know what you're talking about. Why are you talking to me? But pitched in on occasion through 2016, and then 2016 I joined formally to work on Stripe Atlas for a few years. So did that for a few years, bounced around a few different jobs at Stripe, spent some time in the marketing communications department, wrote a lot for the internet, and then ended up on a weird side quest on vaccine infrastructure somewhere in the middle.
The big side quest.
Yeah. I'm glad. Like, I don't mean to minimize it. We think probably saved a few thousand lives on the margin, and so enormously professionally consequential. Probably the most important thing I've ever done in the professional sphere. But the career has been an odd one, to say the least.
I want to on the Colson thing. What do you think? Like you talked about it too, when they were building the initial sort of infrastructure, in some sense, of Stripe in the start. Like you talked about, they knew how to do things. What do you think? How did they plan that out? From what you saw.
So always more useful to get an answer from the horse's mouth. And so if you ever get the opportunity to interview Patrick and or John on the program, would recommend it. I'll say generally, as
right.
like stepping away from Stripe and like particular co-founders of it, the general case of people describing the early days of startups from the perspective of like 10 plus years later often obscures some of what actually happened. Like there are departments upon departments of people whose job is to shape narratives and to streamline things and to make it look like it was more sure of a thing. It was more planned than it was. These people are visionaries, yada yada yada. And and I worked in the communications department. So that disclaimer out of the way, I think that the responsible parties would say in the earliest days, nobody had all the answers. The phrase, we felt like three squirrels in a trench coat pretending to know what we were doing the first time we talked to a bank, has come up before, I think in public, if not, now it's public. And so there is often in the early days, and you lack knowledge of how industries necessarily work. You certainly do not have a fully formed roadmap of like, okay, here's the early beginnings. What's going to look like $1 trillion from now? Good thing I have like all of those dots lined up in advance. Nobody has that crystal ball. And so the thing that you do have in the early days is some amount of taste, some amount of dissatisfaction with the status quo, and understanding like particular ways the status quo was suboptimal. And one of the things that I believe was part of that dissatisfaction was they had experimented a little bit with, they sold the company prior to this, but had experimented a little bit with the selling apps on an app store versus like the traditional ways of taking money for software over the internet, and said, it is like really, really odd how easy transactions are in the App Store model, where Steve Jobs has decreed that for a 30% cut, like money just flows into your bank account, versus how hard they are in the rest of the economy, where transactions are, they do not have a 30% break associated with them. But goodness, you have to, as a business owner, spend so much of your life like dealing with payment problems. And isn't there some like happier median there where a business doesn't necessarily leak 30% of top line revenue, but also doesn't have like the founders sweating payment issues every single day? So like partly it was a reaction to that and figuring out like, okay, for the kind of businesses that we are most accustomed with, where you're selling software or information goods over the internet, what's the thing that they would need to be radically more satisfied with this? Let's go build that. And then, various stuff happened, and the addressable set of users expanded over time, and yada, yada, yada. You can probably read about it in a bunch of pages, but places rather. The business expanded quite a bit past what were presumably their wildest dreams when they were in Buenos Aires back in the day.
Like 2 people like sitting in a room, or 3 people or rather, and planning the payment infrastructure for the internet. How does that trade look like? And this goes to the broader question of how are like infrastructure is built at the simplest. And if you explain that with an example of how the brothers built up or how it works for payments, that would make it simpler to understand.
So there's 2 sub-questions there. There's the how do they successfully convince banks and similar to work with them in the early days, about which I don't know if I have that much to say. And then there's the how did they give a pitch to yours truly. By the time I was actually able to read emails sent to me, the company existed publicly. They had this thing you could sign up for. It had API docs. I found out about Stripe on Hacker News, like a lot of people did, and signed up because I spent far too much of my life reading Hacker News. I say that somewhat sardonically. I think Hacker News is an enormous force for good in the world, in part because it allows people who are building interesting things to talk to each other about building interesting things. But I signed up for Stripe, and it was just transformatively better than payment experiences that I had prior to that. At the time, I was a little bit of a loudmouth on the internet for being, someone who sold software over the internet and blogged about it a lot. But it was certainly not the largest software business, to put it mildly. There's like Microsoft, they're like this big, and then there's like being a car creator, which is like a sub. But I had maybe like one just due to dispositional and personality quirks kind of things. I had spent more time running into payment issues than maybe like the board of Microsoft did. 2, I was running this effectively American software company from adjacent to a rice paddy in central Japan, and so hit more of the international issues than like the typical person did for a while. And so, a thing I very keenly remember about interacting with one payment provider, which will not be mentioned, was that I had a $60 budget for launching my software company back in the day. And I spent over a quarter of it on faxing a contract to this payments provider to like get them
Which one was it?
with allowing me to charge money for software over the internet. And
So you to call them out.
yeah, just the notion. One, there's the Japanese salary man in me. Just like I worked with them of my own volition, valued vendor. I did not stab them in the back, even if it's 15 years later. And then there, that business still exists. It's kind of irrelevant and is an earned form of irrelevant. They've been outcompeted by other providers.
I have no idea who this is.
Anyhow, the notion that I could sign up for a payments provider and just like typey into their sign up form, and then they would say, "Yeah, you seem to be a human. Okay, let's go." Was kind of revelatory. And then the documentation. I don't want to toot the horn of my own old employer, but tooting them for the era on which they were not my employer yet. Back in the day, like your choices for developer documentation, where there was this little company that few people had heard of that had this beautiful site where like all the APIs are searchable. They do deep integration of your API key and the documentation pages. The error messages actually make sense, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can go with provider B, which gives you a 500-page PDF file and says, good luck. And just as a software developer with some level of taste and also some level of I wasn't implementing payments because I love implementing payments so much. I sold bingo cards to elementary school teachers so I could pay my rent, and wanted to go back to the bingo. And this was like easy to get up and started and start doing tests for like conversion rate versus other competing payment providers. And then a couple months later, I had the results of the A/B tests back and wrote some big bullet stripe like, "Hey, BT Dubs, thanks for making me money." So I'm a bit off to the races with respect to some emails back and forth. I remember getting an email back in the day. They had as many small software companies do, they had a page listing many of their customers, and I got an email from somebody at Stripes that day, and they said, "Hey, can we put Bingo Card Creator on our customer list?" I'm like, yeah, sure. And I was so confused. You guys are a real company. Why do you want me there? And apparently, internally, it was like, "Oh, we got him." I'm confused. I've continued to be bemused by that for many, many years. But be that as it may.
What is infrastructure? Like, how do you differentiate between institutional and infrastructure? How do you delineate between them? Differentiate?
That also comes down to a good philosophical question. I joke that I often, in the same way many academics overuse the word culture, I overuse the word infrastructure. So I can a culture of eating healthily be infrastructure? Maybe. I think the things that people typically think of when they think of infrastructure are built technical systems which tend to persist and tend to allow you to do interesting things on top of them, where the nature of that persistence is denominated in generations. And some of those technical systems are, they feel more kind of classically infrastructure in that if you took a photo of them, there would be no humans in the frame. Power poles. Power poles are obviously infrastructure. You take a picture of a power pole, there's no people around it. But obviously there are people involved in the generation of electricity and the transmission of electricity to your workplace or place of residence. And so infrastructure is necessarily a human system in addition to being the technical system. But typically the fact of being widely deployed versus narrowly deployed. Software is a very important component of infrastructure, but like typical one-off software programs are not generally described as it. But when you think of something like the internet is obviously infrastructure. I don't think anyone seriously would deny that. The pervasive availability of Google Search or Google Documents or Microsoft Windows also feels very infrastructure adjacent to me, in kind of finger to the wind sense. And then there's also a very big, you know it when you see it kind of thing. This AI infrastructure, wasn't on day one, but is very, very plausibly getting there very quickly. Or a particular shipped LLMs infrastructure. On day one, they were like a cool thing that some geeks were using on the internet, but then they start getting adopted by the people who build everything that runs the world, and then people start building on top of them. And the really core differentiating thing about infrastructure is that it allows your users to build layers upon layers of very interesting steps that add value on top of the thing that you are creating at that base.
That's what like OpenAI is then. OpenAI is sort of, would you put it as the infrastructure company? Trying to go all over the place.
I think fundamentally, yes. All of the large labs have a variety of different products, and ChatGPT looks maybe less like traditional infrastructure does, and more like a non-infrastructure product looks like. But like the APIs, etc., they seem to me to be very obviously infrastructure. They're designed to be snapped into other things shipped by businesses with very different competences than a leading AI research lab has. And so, I would say that's a very interesting infrastructure company.
How would if you know about OpenAI too, and connect this to the vaccine CA for a moment, how do you plan out when building infrastructure? Like if you were talking to Sam Altman and he was taking building infrastructure advice from you, what would you tell him?
I don't necessarily know that he would have to ask me for advice on that subject, but be that as it may, if you run an AI company, there's a spectrum of AI companies where some of them are building applications and some of them are building the infrastructure that other people build applications on top of. And I think you really have to understand which of those games you're playing in. There are infrastructure companies that have good application level experiences, but that isn't the default. And you kind of have to have, spend some brain sweat on which of these two things we are specializing in. And then every infrastructure company needs to be extremely conversant with the people who are building on top of it, who are almost inevitably going to be taking the thing you built and using it in wildly different ways than you expected to. And you kind of need a finger on the pulse of your user community of, okay, what are you doing right now? And what are you doing right now which is unanticipated but in a wonderful way? And what do we build next to both make it easier and better for you to do the things that are unanticipated but wonderful, and also continue expanding the set of things that can be done with this. And to use not AI but Stripe as an example, a unanticipated thing that happened back in the day with Stripe customers was that in the earliest conception of it, here's an API. It allows you to charge credit cards, and some users were like, okay, I think there are hacky things I can do here, which will allow me to charge a credit card and then pay somebody else. And in the simplest conception of running a business on the internet, where you are charging people value for services and delivering them a license key for your software, you don't have to pay anyone else. But it turned out that there were a lot of interesting, flourishing business models where it was no longer two parties to a transaction. There was really a desire for three. One platform in the middle facilitating a transaction between someone who might be a rideshare driver and the passenger in their car. and okay, we want this transaction for the car ride to be X% to the driver and then Y% to us. Can you facilitate that? And it turns out that is very different needs than the traditional two-party transaction. And Stripe eventually made a product called Stripe Connect.
Stripe Connect.
Yeah.
I know. I use it every single day.
Oh, nice.
It's so bad in India. Apologies.
Oh, no worries. Say the thing that we always say when talking to people, where if you can spare a few moments of your time and write up the reasons that it's bad and send an email, I will happily get that in charge of the right people, in front of the right people, rather. But Connect ended up being a major capabilities increase for companies that were trying to do new business models. And then there were some very large businesses built on top of that by customers and by people who, might have had the business first, but then moved to Connect because Connect was a pain minimizing way to continue running the part of their business that necessarily involved very complex money movement. Here's another thing about institutions that nobody tells you when you're younger. If you successfully create an institution, you don't simply get to rest on your laurels at any point and say okay, congratulations, guys, we won the war against King George III. We are now a government. We're done. You are vastly underperforming your potential if you ever say, all right, we're done. We're the experts on this. We've got all the answers. We just have to grind out next Monday and, keep doing the thing. And so in the Stripe context, someone who can't speak for Stripe, but might be able to predict some things that people at Stripe would say. Their payments isn't done yet. There's only $1 trillion of processing volume that have been facilitated this year. But humanity hasn't invented all the ways that it would possibly decide to transact with each other yet. And it hasn't invented some of those ways because there's no convenient way to do those transactions. There are huge portions of the world where existing products might not work as well as they should. There are many payment methods that we don't take yet, yada, yada, yada. There's so much work to be done. And so it is useful to interact with real users who are hitting those problems in their day-to-day life and to be reminded that we have only accomplished a tiny portion of the challenges to be solved, the people to be served, the artifacts to be shipped to the internet.
What else would you like to add from development?
You have to combine sort of a relentless level of optimism, what your users are capable of doing over a very long time scale, and if we are correct in how we build this thing over a very long time scale, people are going to do wild things on top of it that we can't possibly imagine right now. And combine that with a focus on the details for today, and it is not simply enough to imagine this wonderful magical castle that we will arrive at in 20 years. If we see bare earth in front of us, we have to get to building something upon that bare earth and make a large number of individual steps happen between now and magical castle in the clouds. And so you kind of need to be optimistic with respect to the long-term vision, and then very realistic with respect to what is the next thing we are going to ship, who are the next users we are going to satisfy, what's next rate limiting step. The other thing I would say with respect to early users is you kind of get a choice for who you're building for things early on. For infrastructure companies, there's choose to build for the best users, the ones that are going to push you the fastest, that will help you learn the quickest, help you get to where you're going, versus less consideration with respect to what kind of users you initially target. Back in the day, Stripe targeted startups as the initial seed set of users. And startups are relatively easy to sell on things. They have relatively high standards for the products that they use. They make decisions quickly, and they are themselves growing very fast and have constantly growing expectations for you. And so when you kind of hitch the success of your company to the success of your customers in that fashion, it's great to be, working with hungry, detail-oriented, technically adept, et cetera, customers that are like constantly challenging you for like, we're launching in the Philippines next year. We would like to launch with you in the Philippines, but if not, we're doing it. Versus, there's many organizations in the world that don't have that DNA in them. You could, if you choose like the wrong set of users, you might be kind of incentivized to deliver like lowest common denominator services and optimize for, high level of stability versus like growth and for increasing emissions over time, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you play that 10 years forward, and you will end up with two very different companies on the basis of, among many other decision points, like what kind of users you optimize for first. So now, granted, I don't think startups or technically adept software businesses are the only population in the world worth building for. But given that there are many, many populations in the world, spend an appropriate amount of effort thinking like which ones do you want to serve immediately and what directions are they going to pull us in. Also, like micro tip on this, because I have flubbed this myself, definitely choose to serve users who you like and want to be involved in their lives and involved in their problems for the period of the next couple of years. It's very difficult to do your best work when you're not doing it in the service of people who you like fundamentally really like. And that seems easy to say, and then it's easy to like wander backwards into the failure basis. Like there exist many founders who, if you would ask them, what's your perspective with regards to, I don't know, the typical person working in the government? And they'd say, yeah, broad contempt. No judgment there. Okay. Who's your user? Oh, it's the typical person working in the government. Don't do it, man. Like, you're not going to provide a good thing to them. They are going to read that contempt emanating from you in waves and not like talking to you. Find someone, they're like, certainly they have large budgets. Certainly the government needs better software. Let someone who like is genuinely energized by the prospect of working with people in the government to deliver services to the citizenry, take that. You should work for someone you like, heck, it's like people you like in your life isn't a static quantity. You can simply choose to enjoy the work you are doing. You can simply choose to enjoy the problems of the people that you work with, etc. Like, if you don't on day zero have an overwhelming amount of love and respect for the challenges of and similar of your user population, and you can choose to like flip a switch in your mind and develop love for them and develop a deep respect and develop a overwhelming curiosity about their problems, then flip that switch immediately. And if you can't, like, find someone who you can flip them for.
One question which I like to end with. So I've been like into startups, we see all these things like coding and all these things that like 11. What do you think is one fact that will blow 11-year-old me?
Fact that would blow your mind at 11. Ooh. We talked a little bit earlier about the fractal nature of reality and the fractal nature of economic reality, that any part of the economy necessarily has an incredibly complex ecosystem around it. And even if you interact with that part of the economy as a consumer, you almost cannot appreciate how deep the level of specialization with respect to it goes. The other thing I would say is that while it is the case that there is an incredible level of specialization available that you could spend your entire career on and not plumb the depths of something, that generalists who are, a little sharp and a little high energy, but have no quote unquote formal hard skills relative to simply being intelligent and higher energy and willing to do the work, can achieve incredible things in very many fields, including very many fields that are often heavily associated with high barriers to entry to become a formal credentialed expert. And so that duality in the mind, that like there is fractal detail available everywhere in the economy, and yet you can simply start doing something without loss of generality, payments or finance or medicine or government or similar, is the duality I would like to leave with ambitious 11-year-olds. Or for people.
Yeah, sure.
Be willing to send emails without necessarily having someone having solicited that email from you. That is a skill common to many extremely successful people that I've met in life. And goodness, I did not have it at the age of 16. I'm glad you do. Many people who are listening should borrow this from you. You no apology required. Don't start the email with I'm only blah, 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 blah. But I just have a question for you. Just send the email. Send more emails than you're comfortable doing naturally. It is just strictly upside.
Yeah. That continues to blow 60 and roll me back. But thank you so much for doing this, Patrick. I mean, I learned a lot from this, and I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I'm around the internet. My goodness, I used to have a website I would give out, but now I have so many websites. Kalzumeus, KALZUMEUS.com, or Patio11 on Twitter. If people ever want to get in touch, you can send me an email. My email address is in all places, although I'm increasingly busy about it. I might have to prioritize. But thanks very much, and see you folks around the internet.